historian Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay with us. We all know about him and his work. Yet it is part of me to introduce him. Professor Bandyopadhyay currently working as an emeritus professor of history at T. Herenga Waka Victorian University of Wellington. He taught at University of Calcutta and Kollam University. In 1992, he joined at Victoria University of Wellington. He did his PhD in history from University of Calcutta in 1988. Title of dissertation is Social Mobility in Bengal in the late 19th and 20th century. Some of his notable books are From Policy to Partition and After, A History of Modern India. Caste, Protest and Identity in Colonial India, The Namasudras of Bengal 1872 to 1947. Decolonization in South Asia, Meaning of Freedom in Post-Independence West Bengal 1947-52. Caste Politics and Raj, Bengal 1870-1937. Burma Today, Economic Development and Political Control since 1962. We are overwhelmed and proud to have such a person with us. Today's lecture will be very different from other lectures. Students and attendees will find something new today. We will be known from him how was the journey of becoming Sekhar Bandyopadhyay today. He will also give a new direction to those who are currently engaged in research and those who want to enter the field of research in the future. All in all, it is to be hoped that we are going to witness a very precious moment. Here is Anirban Bandyopadhyay with us. Professor Bandyopadhyay teaches history at Karnavati University, Gandhinagar. He has a PhD from CHS JNU on social and cultural histories of castes in modern India. He has published in academic and other public platforms in Bengali and English over the last 8 years on caste, politics, sports, movies, and books and reading. He has over 6 years experience in academic content delivery over the digital and the online mode. And last of all, I convey my regards Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, Professor Anirban Bandyopadhyay, and my thanks those who have shouldered such a duty here for our university. There is Professor Nandita Bandyopadhyay, coordinator Dr. Chitosri Singho, and all the faculty members of history, and obviously our Vice Chancellor, sir, who always motivated us to arrange such academic endeavor and all the positive thoughts to behalf of our university. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind address. And I don't think that I do really need to introduce Professor Bandyopadhyay, as we all have kind of grown up and reading his writings, reading his articles, his stuff. So what I can just say that with 10 imprints in many years and a lot more, Professor Bandyopadhyay's books, they has by now established itself as perhaps the most widely read and taught general history of modern India. Extensively researched and clearly written, it now comes with a succinct and helpful post-partition survey for the research students, bringing the story of the successes and failures of the Indian nation up to date. And his works are comprehensive, lucid, closely attentive to findings of recent academic research, and scrupulously fair in representing many contentious debates that have occurred in the field, with a new chapter and new insightful observations There he had summarized developments since partition and independence. And I think, and we all hope, that this will continue to be valuable to all the students, teachers, and interested scholars all over the country, all over the world. So now I would request Professor Bandyopadhyay, and I would ask him just to start with the session. And I think even we have a lot of questions from our faculty, from our students, from our scholars. But first of all, let us begin with our the interactive session with Professor Bandyopadhyay and Professor Bandyopadhyay.
No, that's terribly embarrassing. Should I ask a question first? Just call me Anirban. That makes more sense. Yeah.
Okay.
So, thank you, Nandita. It's a bit of a dream come true, but already there's been 2 rounds of introduction. Let me just add 2 more lines and ask my first question, because we will certainly be running short of time for there's so many questions to ask. To my mind, I'd been thinking about Professor Sekhar Bandyopadhyay's academic career, and to find a common thread that ties 3 or 4 distinct domains of specialization that he's written on over the last 40 or so years, a little over 40 years, as a matter of fact. If there was one common thread I found, it should be called space making, really. He's consistently thought about Bengal, India, and New Zealand, where he currently lives, and the ways some of these spaces, all 3 of them, are made by relations of power, as it were, by communities, and how they relate to one another. That is really the thread that ties together his 3 major interest areas, which is caste in case of Bengal and border making. Since then, he moves to researching partition of India and indeed Indian nationalism a little before that. And finally, to questions of how to situate the relations between India and New Zealand, which I dare say form 2 of his homelands, in a manner of speaking at the moment. So I'd like to really reconstruct or sort of try and get a sense of how such a career takes shape over time. I never got a chance to ask these questions before. Let's begin from the beginning. Tell us something about your early life, school and family, and influence of parents, maybe to give us an idea of the kind of enduring values that you carry forward as a scholar and as a human being.
Okay. Let me first start by thanking the Sidho-Kanho-Birsha University for inviting me to participate in what I suggested to be an open-ending kind of discussion or conversation about anything that I have worked on. Don't ask me anything that I don't know. And my sincere thanks to the registrar and Nandita particularly for bringing me into this program. Now, yes, and don't mind me addressing you as Anirban, because otherwise it will be very, it will sound odd if I suddenly start addressing you as Professor Bandyopadhyay or Dr. Bandyopadhyay, whatever. So I'll address you as Anirban. So, yes, Anirban, as you mentioned, when I look back, it's about more than 40 years that I have been in this teaching and research profession. And I have been through various things. That you asked me about my early career. My initial school days were spent in the hill town of Darjeeling, where my father was a professor at Darjeeling Government College. He was an academic. He used to work for the government education, the West Bengal Education Service. So he was being transferred from various place to place. And at one point of time, I was sent to boarding school, which was a Ramdin school in South organized in a place called Sharika. And after that, I went to Presidency College and did my MA at the Calcutta University. I believe I learned a lot from all these educational institutions. Ramakrishna Mission, my boarding school experience taught me discipline in life. But more than that, what I really cherish about my school days that in that school we were involved in various kinds of social welfare activities, and these activities involved range of things like participating in volunteer firefighting groups or going from village to village, collecting subscriptions for mass feast for the poor, which gave me an exposure to the rural life of Bengal, which rarely middle-class urban children get exposed to. And I could see the village life. I could see damning poverty. I could see how people would labor within that situation. So this was a very practical kind of training, which I cherish and I treasure throughout my life. And I think this had a big impact on how I later on went into my historical research. Eventually in Presidency College, obviously the experience was very rich. I learned history from some of the very illustrious teachers of those days, like Oshin Dasgupta or Hiren Chakraborty, who gave me the first lessons of historical inquiry. But I would also say that in Presidency College, I learned as much outside the classroom as well as inside the classroom. I mean, I learned more about life, about many things, and then I went into Calcutta University, where I was again taught by a number of very well-known historians who eventually became my role models, like Amodesh Tripathi, Binoy Chaudhuri, Nilmani Mukherjee. All of them were luminaries in the world of modern Indian history at that time. When I went into historical research, when I started my PhD research, I can say it was from that point of time I really got hooked to history. Before that, I was reading history for passing the exams. But when I started teaching history, and more importantly, when I started researching history, I began to love history as a subject, that I can say. So, and then the research went through various stages. I mean, when I started research in the early 1970s, mid-1970s, the major research methodology which was being used and which we were recommended was a kind of serendipitous research. I mean, we were being told, go to archives, and archives will help you to frame your questions. Identify a broad area of research where you are interested, and with that broad area in mind, go to archives, and archives will tell you what kind of questions you have to probe. And that was a kind of serendipitous research which we were exposed to. And in those days, we had time. I mean, I finished my PhD in 8 years, but these days, no one can afford to do that. So initially, I can remember, I started work. I mean, I wanted to work on Bhadralok culture in the early 20th century. With that kind of topic in mind, I went to the archives. And then I kind of found enormous amount of material in the archives about how caste as an identity, caste as a system was important in Bengal's life. I mean, this was a kind of revelation to me because I was brought up in a cultural milieu in Bengal, in Bhadralok culture in Bengal, which made me to think that caste did not matter in Bengal or in the historical period. And when I went into the archives, I realized how very effectively, importantly, it mattered. And there was so much material in the archives. And then I found that there was so much material on the Namashudras, which no one, no historian before me had used. So that kind of, I started to work on the high culture of the Bhadralok, and then I moved into the more structural situations, particularly focusing on caste. And around that time, what had not been done, I mean, I'm not saying that I started caste studies for Bengal. Before me, Hitesh Ranjan Sannal had written. Before that, N.K. Bose had written. And Shomen Mukherjee, Ramkrishna Mukherjee, everyone had written. But those writings were more focused on the structural aspects of it, like social structure, social mobility, and so on. None of them had really looked at the lower caste struggles and had, in today's parlance, the people we call Dalit. So those groups were not in the historical mainstream research until that time. So yeah, I kind of moved into that area, and through what we used to do those days, like serendipitous research, just go to archives. So my method remains very, very, very embedded in archives, although in later life I moved from there, not from archives, but I have started realizing that archives should be redefined. I mean, what we used to understand by archives in the 1970s and 80s is now different now. I mean, that concept needs to change. Okay, I'll pause there. Anirban, you're muted.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I was wondering really to ask you a follow-up question on your early research career. It delved very deeply into what is now called the colonial archive and sociology of knowledge during the early colonial times. You wrote about Riesly, in particular, a very old article in the 1970s, I remember. What was it like to research caste? I mean, you made it sound that there was some kind of a precedence. Of course, Hitesh Babu was writing about caste, but he was writing from a perspective of social mobility under an overall nationalist style of writing history. Whereas you did not depart initially too much from it, but you delved more towards a different kind of archive-based material. And the early material that you used, which you've used subsequently in your first monograph, Caste Politics and the Raj, is heavily based on late 19th century and early 20th century politics of representation before the colonial state. So, and later in your research career, you moved from representation to the colonial state to representation of the groups themselves by their own voice in their own autonomous kind of domain in your probably third book on caste, culture, and hegemony. In the middle, the one that you wrote in 1997, Caste and Protest and Politics, of course, Caste, Politics, and Identity, which is a more story, sort of more directly a story of the Nomoshudras' struggle in their own terms. How do you look at your research on Nomoshudras as a community change over the years from a stage where they were writing, and others, indeed, other castes too, to the colonial state, towards a position where you moved to questions of culture and hegemony in Bengali society? How does that shift happen in your focus, in your research career, from the serendipity to more of a self-conscious strategy or historiography of your own?
To tell you frankly, I mean, when I first came across these materials in the archives related to caste, I mean, Hitesh Ranjan Sannal's Social Mobility in Bengal, that book was really my model. I mean, that was the main model. But other than that, there was the famous article by S.N. Mukherjee on caste and class in Calcutta, where he looks at the intersectionality between caste and class. But if you remember, I mean, the 1970s, early 1980s, all the kind of historical and sociological work in the that was available in the 1980s were all focused on the colonial archives, or not just colonial archives. There were a lot of field studies as well, but colonial government was the main focus. I mean, everything was going round the colonial government and how colonial rule defined it and so on, and how the people were responding to it. I mean, when reading the colonial archives, it first struck to me that we need to kind of question the colonial archives. And that is where, if you remember my Caste Politics and the Raj, the first chapter is the colonial construction of caste. So instead of, I mean, if you look at the works before me, like, for example, N.K. Bose, where you see he's taking census reports almost as fact statements of facts. And I was kind of thinking that these statements need to be questioned, because this is also construction. And Barnett Cohn had already come up with some writings, and definitely I was influenced by Cohn's writings. And I could see that the later policies of the colonial government was emanating from that sociological and ethnological construction of caste by colonial rule. And I agree to some extent. My first book also shows that how the caste associations were responding to that. And I'm quite aware, I mean, that book was published in 1990. I'm quite aware that at that point of time, I was, to a very large extent, very nationalist. And one of my own criticism of the 1990 book is that it is too nationalist. I should have also questioned and interpreted the caste association's responses possibly in a different way. And I can tell you that book is now being translated into Bengali, but I'm not publishing exact translation. I'm revising it, because I think that needs to be questioned, and some of the questions needs to be reframed. So, but from that, I mean, remember, I mean, my second book on the Namashudras was also part of my PhD thesis. It was a second part of my PhD thesis, which was done in 88. But when I published in 1997, I had completely rethought the whole questions. And I was looking more at the culture, and where I found the Motua kind of phenomenon, which I can say that I never have seen any reference to that particular religious movement, except a very brief reference in Shashi Bhushan Dasgupta's book. Even Ramakanto Babu mentions it in a passing. No one really dealt with it. But I found this was a major movement in East Bengal countryside at that time, and later on, after partition, it was it was in existence in a major way in North 24 Parganas and other parts of the province. So I was drawn into that cultural interpretation and also the struggle for it. And then I also found the other realization that my reading of these documents and also the writings of the Namashudras as well told me that the Dalit groups did not really represent a homogeneous entity. I mean, we cannot say in terms of the behavior of the Namashudras. I mean, there were various ideas, various strands within the Namashudra movement. And I thought that needs to be pointed out. And what I found that while there was a mainstream caste movements, identity representation movement, on the other side, the same people were participating in various other kinds of movement, like Devagha movement, or even Hindu Mahasabha mobilization was quite successful in mobilizing many of the Namashudras in the Eastern Bengal countryside. Not that, I mean, I do not argue that I mean, we need to make a distinction here. What my argument was that at that point of time in the in the second half of the 1940s, when the partition was coming up and various other kinds of movements were becoming powerful, these people were also responding to the parallel streams of politics. So there were various trends, and that's why the movement was moving into various directions, which was one of the reasons why this politics of representation was kind of weakened around that time, which was engulfed by the partition movement. Some people have read it as if I was arguing that the movement kind of was assimilated into mainstream nationalism. I never used assimilation. What I was arguing was integration. Integration is not assimilation. Integration is a strategic alliance with various kinds of groups in a particular historical conjuncture. And I found that the partition politics was a major watershed in the history, social history of these movements. And also I found that what you mentioned at the very beginning, I also found the importance of space in the history of social movements. And rarely in the study of caste movements, the importance of space has been mentioned, but I found space plays a very significant role in how these movements are mobilized. And people, I mean, all the caste movements that have developed over the time, where you have spatial concentration of a particular group in a particular area, it is much easier to have social mobilization among those groups. And therefore, I mean, and from there, my next major interest in research came up, that when, as a result of partition, that habitational space is threatened or taken away, the movement takes various other directions. And so partition, as a result, acted as a major watershed in the social and political history of the Namshudras, or even for that matter of the Rajbanshis, whose habitational space was also threatened by the partition. So yeah, I mean, I started with the old premise, which kind of was looking at caste movements as a response to colonial policies and colonial construction of caste and so on. But I moved on to the more autonomous kind of movements and the urges within the community to define their identity independently of British census operations or caste policies or reservation policies and so on. You have to unmute yourself.
You have to unmute your mic.
Yeah. I'm good. In fact, somebody told me early on that I should mute myself while he's talking. There's some kind of ambient noise. I do it and I forget to switch it on. Sorry. So I was hoping to raise two theoretical questions. You're not exactly a historian who fancies theory so much. That must be made clear at the outset. But I also found a resonance of the earlier point you made about the serendipity of many of your formulations later on, with the fact, and it's very ironical to that extent, that your major formulation, you've probably written only one paragraph trying to define the caste system in Bengal. And that is found in an essay not so much on caste, but on widows, on gender. One of your essays that is one of my personal favorite, but is not so familiar with the current trend or crop of scholars, where you compare the caste system or Bengal society with a kind of chain, where it's possible to take off one of the units, but not quite possible to shake off the entire chain. And later, still earlier, it sort of borrows or at least draws from formulations by N.K. Bose, who you referred, who also wrote about roughly in the similar vein with Brahmanism towards the later part of his career, where there's, so long as one admits the broad strains of it, Brahmanism in Bengal is not particularly keen to enforce or physically dominate. And that makes for a peculiar kind of configuration of questions of caste in Bengal. I'd like, rather against your wish, for you to speak about this position of yours, because there is a huge degree of misunderstanding on questions of caste or Bengal society in the rest of India. Only last couple of days ago, there was this article, a report on a talk by Kancha Ilaiah, which everyone circulated. The catchline was Bengalis do not understand caste at all, and that they should start public discussions on caste. So this is one of my questions, to pose it in a slightly more theoretical terms, drawing from your earlier work, and also to respond to a largely non-Bengali audience about how caste has been traditionally and recently seen in Bengal. The question of it historically speaking.
My position on this, which I have written in a few essays later on, I published one essay with the title, Does Caste Matter in Bengal?
More recently, yeah.
More recently. Actually, I found it in Jain Bhattacharya's book, one observation, where Bhattacharya, who was very much associated, was writing on caste system, he was associated with the Brahminical Brahmin Association and so on. He makes a very crucial, which struck me really, he makes a very crucial observation that caste system, if you look at it from the top, it looks like a golden chain. If you look at it from the bottom, it looks like an iron chain. Now, this observation really struck me. And around that time, I was looking at writing an essay on Vidyasagar's movement on widow remarriage. And I found that a lot of the opposition that was coming from the caste question. And I developed it later on in more details, where I found that my understanding that this was the fundamental problem of Bengali modernity and the Bengal reform movement of the 19th century and early 20th century, from which there is, I think there is a genealogy of this idea which is developing later on into Gandhi's own ideas in the 1930s, that it questioned untouchability, but it more or less accepted the caste system. Caste system as a normative system determining the social behavior of the members of Hindu society, this was kind of accepted, widely accepted in the society. There was never any questions raised. The literate society, the Bhadralok society, was prepared to accept minor reforms at an individual level, as long as that individual variation, the individual violation of caste rules did not impact the overall structure of the society or overall structure of the normative system that is the Hindu society. And that is where it is like a chain. How a chain works. If any particular component of the chain is broken, the chain loses its binding power. So the chain is kind of various components tied together. And if one component breaks, the chain loses its binding power. And there was a tacit consensus within the Bengali Hindu society that that chain cannot be kind of altered, because that maintains the discipline of the society. That kind of dictates the normative aspects of the Hindu society. But the problem is what Ambedkar said, that you cannot really deal with untouchability without reforming the caste system, because in order to be upper caste, you need to have a lower caste. So what happened in Bengal as a result of this contradiction of its own modernity, there was from the very beginning, from Vivekananda to Rabindranath Tagore, there were continuous criticism of the worst forms of untouchability. As a result of that, the caste violence, which we find in other parts of India, that intensity of caste violence was definitely reduced, but caste system was never questioned, was never challenged, was never was up for reform or anything. So that is if you want me to theorize, is that the caste as a normative system is based on a consensus within the Bengali Hindu society, whereas the Bengali Hindu society also thinks that the crudest forms of untouchability was unacceptable. So the caste violence has been reduced, but caste system is firmly there. In every aspects of it, and it gets expressed in various forms over the years. Does that answer your question?
To this question, slightly later towards the end, vis-a-vis certain recent occurrences, but I would now like to move to the second, perhaps, part of your research, which is partition and resettlement. And of course, that too is connected with your larger previous interest with caste. Why and how did that shift happen in your career, decolonization and partition and rehabilitation? What explained that shift that takes place, I think, by the late 90s or early 2000s or mid 2000s to be more precise?
Mid 2000. After I finished Placido Partition.
Right. That is another question that I must ask. I'll come to that. Yeah.
Yes, that shift, I won't say it is a shift, but rather it's a continuation. My earlier study on the Namashudras ended in 1947. Now, I often thought that was a kind of arbitrary kind of finish line that I'm accepting. And I also was baffled by the situation that a particular movement of a community which was so powerful, so effective, so articulate before 1947, after 1947, we just do not see that movement anywhere. Not in the public space. It is not reported in the newspapers. I do not find them in the legislative assemblies. So what happened to this movement? It cannot just disappear like that. So, and then it kind of struck that it was possibly because of the partition movement. It was the partition which kind of upset or kind of unsettled the history of this particular movement, which needed to be addressed. And also my work on the Placido Partition also told me that 1947 was not a logical culmination date for any historical research. History did not stop in 1947. There were a lot of continuities, a lot of disjunctions, which needed to be put in perspective, put in context, and needed to be understood. So I then moved into the post. I think you have to mute your microphone because it's kind of creative. Yeah, thank you. So I moved into the post-partition, post-1947 period. And initially, once again, in a very serendipitous way, I looked at the total history of what was happening after 1947. So I looked at the first 5 years of independence in 1947, where my major issue was, my major point I wanted to make was that when India got its independence in 1947, it is a watershed point, as political sovereignty is now more clearly defined in terms of the nation state. But there was no consensus on the future of the nation. There were many voices. I mean, that was also something which comes from my reading for Passage to Partition, that we cannot say that in 1947 the Indian nation was speaking in one voice, apart from the demand that we all want independence. So those many voices needed to be explored, needed to be identified, and their history needed to be traced. So my first one, which was, I initially titled it Meanings of Freedom in Post-Independence West Bengal, but my publisher added a main title, Decolonization in South Asia, because they thought it would sell better if it had a more general title. But it was really, my point was to look at when independence arrived, different groups of people were making different meanings of freedom. And they were visualizing different trajectories of how this nation would eventually develop after independence. And from there, I could trace once again the Namashudras beginning to appear, but in a very, very different way. And so after that, I moved on to this whole question of partition and repatriation, and rehabilitation. What I found, that they disappeared from this post-partition history because they did not migrate immediately after 1947. They did not migrate until 1950. So there was a 3 years gap, and most of the partition histories, refugee histories, are mostly focused on those who migrated immediately after 1947. So, and then I moved into that post-1947 history, which when I started researching in the 1970s, it was some kind of a taboo. We were not certainly encouraged to research on contemporary history, but I think that should go. So I moved into that period and found out what happened to this community, Namashudra community, after 1947, and most importantly, after 1950, and eventually after that. So it was more a continuation of my earlier work than a shift.
Well, it seemed to be both, given the trajectory of how it sort of developed over the years. Since you referred to the trend of research when you started was to sort of look at 47 as some kind of an unbridgeable boundary of sorts. And that brings me to the textbook question, really, in both senses. You wrote it roughly, I suppose, by the turn of the millennium. Also,
it was first published in 2004.
Yeah, but you put in walking early.
I finished it around 2002.
Right. So pretty much timed around the millennium. And also probably or indirectly as, and I don't know this, it's my guess, you have to correct me or prove me unfounded. Did you write it because you have to teach a course on Indian civilization and history as a whole after you moved to New Zealand? Did that shift have anything to do with it?
Yes, this was to a very large extent because of my move to New Zealand, where I had to teach general history, Indian history, mainly modern period. But more importantly, I was, as you know, my previous research was entirely very significantly based on archives. Now I was in a situation, I was thousands of miles away from my archives. So for the time being, I could not take up any project based on archival research. At that point of time, I first went back, I went to New Zealand in 1992, and at that point of time, I started revising the Nomoshudra part of the book. I came back to India and went to London for brief trips, just to add a little bit more materials and kind of reframe the questions and rewrite it. By 1997, that book was out. And I was thinking, what next? And at that point of time, it was Orion Longman. Orion Longman invited me to write a textbook on Indian history. So I thought I have a very good option here, because I had a very good library at my disposal. And our library is part of the international interlibrary loan system. So I could have books from anywhere in the world. So I did not have access to archive, but I had access to a very good library. So I could use that. So, and I was teaching a very broad survey of modern Indian history. So when you teach such survey courses, you begin to develop a plan, a kind of structure within which you could frame this very broad macro history. But also what happened, I did not want to make it just any other textbook. And what I wanted to do is to put it within the historiographical context. I mean, by that time, I would think I had matured as a historian, and I had started questioning certaintyist history. So I was kind of realizing that there can be many interpretations of history. So one has to take into account those many interpretations before situating your own interpretation of it. So if you see that it was very consciously, the narrative of the Placido partition is situated within its historiographical context. So I bring in the historiography very consciously and in sometimes very details. And sometimes people have complaints. Why so much historian's name? I mean, I think you need to know the historian's name, other people's works, in order to understand the various aspects of a particular phenomenon.
That gets me to the second major concern of yours during this phase. You published also a reader on nationalism, and you've repeatedly said, and later you also admitted earlier today, that you've been criticized for appearing way too nationalist, and your position on nationalism also has evolved. In Placido partition itself, your nationalism appears to be some kind of a platform where a number of voices are inscribed, really speaking. But did you also at that stage or later address the question that some of these voices carried greater power and authority than others? And this is really a question on your general reflection on the question of nationalism as such, because the next question will be about your study of diaspora and larger geographical configurations, really.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you look at my Placido partition, you see that all those multiple voices of the nation comes in one chapter, whereas the rest of the book is on the mainstream nationalism, because that is the fact that this mainstream nationalism kind of dominated and kind of sometimes even tried to suppress the other voices that were in place. And that is something which I'm going to develop further in my next book on the partition and the Dalit refugees, that how very consciously those voices have been silenced, or there were attempts to silence those voices. And the reader on nationalism also kind of questions the mainstream nationalism, the mainstream narrative of nationalism, and where I kind of tried to argue that since 1947 we have been talking about unity in diversity. Possibly it's time that we talk about diversity in unity, rather than put the diversity word in front and then the unity later. So yes, I mean, absolutely, as I was saying, my view on nationalism has very significantly changed since at the time when I was writing Passage to Partition, and I was reading the materials from all parts of India and from various classes, castes, communities, gender, and so on.
Right. I wish now to ask you about your other, probably lesser known aspect of research in India in particular. You're known for your scholarship on caste and for the textbook, but over the last 8, 9, 10 years, you've published widely on India-New Zealand relations, questions of development. You've supervised a thesis on histories of science. Now, how does this third aspect of Sekhar Bandyopadhyay as a scholar to be read by readers and scholars in India? That's slightly distant, apparently, from their immediate concern. How does it tie up with your earlier?
Yeah, I'm very much involved and engaged in research on the diaspora. I mean, this is part of, say, continuation of my introspection on nationalism, and partly questioning my own identity. I mean, this whole interest in the diaspora began when, in around 1995, I decided my university gave me a permanent position, and I decided to stay back. And at that point of time, I began to question myself, who I am, how, as a part of the diaspora, I stand in a different country, yet teaching about the country where I was born. And my national identity was very powerful in me, even at that time. So my research on diaspora kind of started as an autobiographical search, that what was the history of Indian migration to the furthest part of the British Empire, which was New Zealand, from India. And as I started reading a little bit of New Zealand history, because at that point of time, I decided that I would stay back in New Zealand, I found out that in 1809, the first Indian to come and settle down was from Bengal. I mean, he was from Chittagong. I mean, he came as with a East India Company ship, and he jumped ship. He came as a ship hand mariner, and he jumped ship and married a local Maori woman and settled down. So I thought, even though possibly he did not speak the same Bengali language I speak, yet he's from the same part of the South Asian subcontinent where I belong to. And then I started looking at the history of Indian migration. I started visiting the New Zealand archives. I mean, that's what a historian do, and I'm the archive-loving historian, so to say. So I began to look at the New Zealand archives. I began to look at the history of early Indian migration. But at that point of time, it also struck that all the literature on the diaspora, they only look at, or mainly look at, the members of the diaspora. their identity formation, their problems, and that's all. But there is also another side. The migrants come to a host society. So my question was also how the host society responded to these migrants coming. That is, the host society's racial biases, its own policies of immigration restriction, what many historians have called that around after the First World War, throughout these white settlement colonies, a racial color barrier was being established. So how did it discriminate against the Indians coming here? Coming to the most modern period when New Zealand, both New Zealand and Australia now claim to be multicultural society. So my question was, what did multiculturalism actually mean for these migrants? How inclusive is this model of multiculturalism so far as the migrants from non-white and non-English speaking societies coming to this society? So my first article which I wrote was to question this whole multiculturalism that New Zealand, Australia was propagating. My second article, which became very controversial, I was asked to contribute an article in a special volume of New Zealand Journal of History. That special volume was on the New Zealand nation, where I started to argue that the mainstream narrative of New Zealand nation presents it as a primarily kind of white nation and bilingual, bicultural, it tries to integrate the local Maori population, but it forgets that almost from the very beginning of settlement in New Zealand, Indians were coming from another part of the British Empire. And so they cannot be just wished away from the mainstream narrative of the New Zealand nationhood. So, yeah, I mean, so you can say that getting into this was part of my own seeking of self-identity, looking at my self-identity. And then what happened in 2012, there is a long history, I'm not going into that, but 2012, I succeeded in convincing New Zealand government and the then government of India, when Manmohan Singh was the Prime Minister, to establish New Zealand India Research Institute. In 2012, the New Zealand Prime Minister went to India, and then it was followed up by a treaty signed between India and New Zealand, which was an India-New Zealand education exchange program, under which a New Zealand India Research Institute was established, and I was appointed of its founding director. And the mandate was also to develop India-New Zealand relationship. And then once again, I mean, as I always do as an academic, I went to the history, and I found that India-New Zealand relationship was much deeper, much longer than it is often recognized, either in New Zealand or in Australia or in India. I mean, I could see while looking at the New Zealand newspapers, Indian news were very regularly published in New Zealand newspapers. When 1857, 1858 rebellion was being, mutiny was being suppressed, all the reports were coming up in New Zealand newspapers, and the local Maori were being told that, look, this is what happens if you challenge the British Empire. So that was kind of a lesson for the local indigenous population. So yes, I mean, and later on the trade, in terms of trade, almost East India Company ships visited very regularly the shores of Australia and New Zealand. So the relationship was much older, and it continues into contemporary period. So yes, I mean, it's some kind of a outgrowth from my staying in New Zealand, and because of my responsibility as the director of the institute, and I kind of tried to intellectualize it and looked at it rather than doing it as an administrative responsibility.
Well, you put it wittily indeed. And well, there are so many questions on the chat box that I should really stop, because left to myself, I have too many questions to ask. I'll ask one final question, and then if there is time after you've answered these questions, I can get back to asking other questions. This is about Sekhar Bandyopadhyay, the teacher, the scholar, so much really not about the scholar, the mentor, the PhD supervisor, the director of India New Zealand Research Institute, the administrator, intellectual, as you put it. Well, if I were to be a little cheeky, I could say it reminds me of the British administrators of the 19th century, who also were at the same time bureaucrat anthropologists. But you certainly are not one of those. To kind of wrap it up in a general question, how would you look at your role differently from those scholar administrators? Were they administrator scholars and you were scholar administrator, or vice versa? And as a mentor, of course.
Look, whenever I did administration, I tried very consciously to maintain my scholarly identity. When I was doing very heavy administrative duty, at one point of time, I was head of school of a very large school and doing at the same time the job of a director of an institute, which was a consortium of scholars of 7 different universities. I kept on teaching, I kept on supervising, and I kept on writing. Because I thought, if I don't do this, I will lose my real identity of a scholar. So at the end of the day, I still look at myself more as a scholar and teacher rather than as an administrator. I did administration and I was asked to do administration, and I tried to do a good job. That's all.
I guess we should really start looking at the questions from the chat box. If I may request, Nandita, will you please?
Yes, there are.
Yeah,
I will. And in fact, there are a few questions, and even our faculty members, like Professor Naju Hashta, today morning, he had sent me that was some 4 or 5 questions. I think I have compiled those questions. I will just quickly read it out. Yeah. So this is the one. I'll just. Naju, are you there? Are you there? Okay. So, Professor Naju Hashta, he is also a faculty. He teaches. He is an assistant professor, Sidho-Kanho-Birsha University, Department of History. So he asks, number 1, does Motua sect represents the whole Nomoshudras in West Bengal's political arena? Shall I read out all the questions, sir? Or there are 2, 3.
If you group them together into
right. I will do so. I will do so. Yeah, actually, there are 4 questions by Naju. So that was the reason I thought that if he is here, he could have asked it himself. Number 2, it is. Question number 2 is, do you think that Gandhiji was responsible for introducing symptom in Indian nationalism by sloganeering Ram Rajya?
Okay.
Number 3, what were basic ideological differences between Mahatma M.K. Gandhi and Dr. B.R. Ambedkar regarding caste question? Number 4, do you think that the Adivasis are under immense threat of cultural domination in post-colonial India or mostly in recent?
Okay. So
Right.
let me
Religious center. Number two was, it was on this Gandhiji's question was, he was responsible for introducing religious center, he mentioned. Right. Yes, sir. Yeah.
First of all, the first question, Motua sect, no, it does not represent all the Namashudras. It did not represent in the past the whole Namashudra community, and it does not represent all the Namashudras in the present. That's my reading of the situation. And also within the Motua sect, there are also divisions. The main family, which was responsible for organizing this whole movement, this family itself is now divided. So, I mean, as I began responding to Anirban, that Dalit communities, Namashudra community have never been a homogeneous community. There are various kinds of political strands, and there are various kinds of religious, spiritual strands. And so it's a diverse group. But I can say Motua community or Motua Mahashangho represents a very large proportion of the Namashudra community. But whether in political terms they would vote in the same way, I'm not sure about, not so sure about that. But as possibly as a social religious community, it represents a very large section of the community, that's no doubt. Gandhi responsible for introducing religious rhetoric, of course. Everyone has said that was Gandhi's strategy of organizing or mobilizing political support. But the problem is Gandhi did not use Ram Rajya in a very religious sense. Gandhi, if you read Gandhi's ideas of Ram Rajya, he was actually redefining Ram Rajya. By Ram Rajya, he was not meaning the mythical kingdom of mythical god King Rama, but rather the ethical domain which he thought would be an ideal political alternative to the British, the institutional setup of the parliamentary system that the British were preaching as the model. So yes, on the one hand, he was responsible for kind of popularizing the term Ram Rajya, but he was using it in a different sense. And now this has become a different kind of term, which was more kind of, I think it's more kind of reinvented rather than the exact thing which was meant by that. Ideological differences between Gandhi and Ambedkar, a lot of writing has already gone into it. What I understand, the fundamental difference between Gandhi and Ambedkar about the caste system is that Gandhi saw it as a religious system, and Ambedkar mainly pointed out the power structure, power aspect of this whole caste system. He thought that religion was important, but main important part of why the caste system perpetuated itself was because it was embedded in a power structure. So unless we empowered the Dalit, the caste system and the untouchability, those things will not go. But Gandhi almost completely ignored the power aspect of the caste system. I mean, that's my understanding. I mean, there are other differences as well, but if you ask me to identify the fundamental difference, I think that is understanding of the power aspect of the caste system is where the two differ. Adivasis threatened by cultural domination. Absolutely, you are absolutely right. I do not go into contemporary politics too much, but this is, in a way, it's a cultural domination, but in a very significant way, it is also economic domination. What I see today, that this tribal areas are being opened up for resource extraction and violating all kinds of environmental norms, but that's that's a different question, and which comes with the cultural domination, that the threat of cultural domination as well. So that will be very, very briefly my response to your 4 questions, which are very wide-ranging.
Thank you, sir. We have number of questions actually still now. We have 2 senior professors, Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay and Professor Amyo P. Shane. I could just see. So, sir, would you like to comment, or do you have, if they want to have any kind of observations made on the discussions that we are having from the morning? Okay, I think Professor Bandyopadhyay had left. He was just here a little while back.
I saw him.
Yeah, Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay, and then Professor Amyo P. Shane, he was also there. And I think there were others from Professor K.S. Madhavan from Calicut University. Are you here?
Yes, sir. I am here. Thank you.
Okay. So, Professor, why don't you, can you just switch on your camera for a while? Right.
Okay. I will.
Yes. Why don't you just do a brief introduction and just ask him the questions that you were telling me?
Okay, I will. Okay. Definitely I will ask.
Yes,
I'm very
yes,
happy and privileged to hear
Right.
wonderful lecture of Professor Bandyopadhyay. Even I have all read his books and suggested to my students in Calicut University, where I teach for 15 years. My question is, it may be in the form of a question. What is the first question is related to the intersectionality of the caste, on which he has made some reference in the beginning of his lecture, focusing on the social modernization process that is happening in the Bengal. The similar kind of thing had already been here in Kerala too. That is one of the part of the untouchable communities like the Pulayas. And considering the caste aspect, one can see that there is a entanglement process of the caste and class, or what we call the intersectionality of the caste and class. So could you reflect upon the intersectional aspect of the caste and caste involved in the transformational process of the Namashudra movement in the Bengal? That is one first question. The second question is that related to the what we call, you have mentioned about the colonial construction of the caste. For example, from the writings of Nicholas Dirks or Bernard Cohen, these people, the anthropologists turned historians. That is the Chicago anthropologist historian who actually introduced the notion that the caste had been largely created by the colonial administrative modalities. But at the same time, I would rather to say that the so-called the Brahmanism or the Brahmanical intellectual culture had already been created through this process as well. It is the colonialism created a different kind of the intellectual Brahmanism or Brahmanical intellectual habitus and Brahmanical intellectual writing culture, which also contributed even in determining the conceptual categories of the nationalism itself. Could you reflect upon these points? Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Madhavan. These are 2 very important questions. I responded to Anirban by mentioning that I always think that the Dalit groups whose history we look at, their movement, they have never been homogeneous groups. And in my study of the Namashudra movement, I have found this caste-class intersectionality was one of the most important factors. And my major argument was, where the caste and class converged, we had a major powerful movement. But where caste and class diverged, then the movement declined or was weakened. So what we found that at the initial stage of the movement, there was a convergence of caste and class, where the movement was on the one hand developing and constructing identity. On the other hand, they were fighting with the local landlords. I mean, if we look at the land distribution structure of Eastern Bengal, where this movement was getting traction, the majority of the landlords were the upper castes and some Sayyid Muslims. where the majority of the cultivators, majority of the peasants were either Namashudras or the Muslims. So what we find in the early period of this movement, that the Namashudra peasants and the Muslim peasants were uniting against their upper caste landlords. And these were the kind of incidents which were happening in a kind of series in the East Bengal countryside in the late 19th, early 20th century. But eventually what happens, there is a limited amount of social mobility within the Namashudra community. Some of them becomes educated and highly educated. Some of them then go to the legislative assemblies. Some of them get government positions. And at that point of time, towards the 1940s and so on, the aspirations, what I see, the aspirations of the caste elite, the counter elite, and the interests of the peasants of the community began to diverge. And at that point of time, the movement is being weakened. And that's my observation of this situation. So my conclusion was that when caste and class converged, the movement was most powerful. But when caste and class diverged, the movement was tended to weaken. So that's my position. About the colonial construction, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, Ducks and others who have kind of argued that the caste was something only in the mind. I mean, that's obviously not true. I mean, it was not entirely the colonial construction, but what remains to be seen is that how colonial construction kind of interpreted the existing system and how that interpretation eventually influenced their policies. That is something which needs to be looked at. And if you look at my 1990 book, where long before Nicholas Ducks, I had looked at the colonial construction of caste through Risley and others, where I had very specifically pointed out that this colonial interpretation was very much colored by their own political interests.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Okay, Nandita, any other
sir. Thank you, Madhavan sir. Yes, sir, there are a lot of questions actually from the scholars, from the faculties, and even we are giving our students also the opportunities, the PG students. I think they're also participating, so they can also pose a question, which is not a problem. So my second, after Professor Madhavan, it is from Shubhankar. He is also our colleague. He teaches in our department. Shubhankar, are you there? Shubhankar, are you there? Hello? Okay, so he had sent his question actually. Even there are a lot of questions coming up in the chat box, I think. So Shubhankar's question is, why 1947, your thought, why 1947 ... your thought on Indian independence? And okay, 1 minute. How do you describe, quote, temple of modern India, unquote, and their destructive effect on Adivasi people after the wake of independence?
So what was the first part of the question?
Why 1947? What exactly is your thought on Indian independence? I think it's like that.
Well, 1947 was a definite watershed in the history of in the history of modern India, because at that point of time we are having a transfer of political power, and a sovereign nation state is born. I mean, you can say, I mean, the Communist Party was saying that it was not a true independence or whatever, but the fact remains that there was the transfer of power and the political sovereignty was transferred to an independent nation state. But I would still argue that this was not a social, economic, and political watershed as such. This was one important thing that happened, but there was a lot of continuity, and I have an edited book, The Politics of Transition and Decolonization, where if you look at the introduction, I've tried to argue that there was a lot of continuity and change. And what appears to be continuity, in some cases, they were also undergoing significant changes. So, and this was happening in terms of institutions. This was happening in terms of ideas. This was happening in terms of principles of governance, where we see both continuity and change. And historians, number of historians, like, say, for example, Dipesh Chakraborty has argued, and I agree with that this transition of 1947 was a very incomplete and messy affair. So there was no clear break, but there was a lot of continuities and at the same time a lot of change. The temples of modern India, I mean, it depends on who you ask. I mean, if you ask the Nehruvians, they will say the modern institutions like scientific institutions, the dams, the industries, those are the temples of modern India. But there was also a kind of underlying kind of assumptions that modernization will take over India and that can take care of all the problems India had. And but that really did not happen, because the modernization policies themselves, the development policies themselves, were very contradictory. And of course, the whole question of Adivasi autonomy, the region's environmental issues and the unbridled extraction of resources, and those issues actually remain. I mean, this is a very complex issues, and some of them I tried to summarize and argue in the new edition of the Placido Partition, which has a new chapter added on post-independence India, where I tried to argue the problems of these developmental policies and how those policies kind of trampled some of the traditional ideas and institutions in India.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Shubhankar here. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay,
Thank you.
Shubhankar is here. Okay. So we have few more questions, and I think Professor Anirban would like to ask a final one. Like he said, Anirban, shall I continue with few more questions?
Nandita,
exactly?
I'll slightly add a bit of a bind, because we were. Let me just ask one, and maybe if Professor Bandyopadhyay agrees, we'll carry on. And
Right.
This is slightly about methodological. I wanted to ask it towards the end, and I was told we'd end around 12:30. So I kind of was.
That was roughly. Actually, we had planned that we will wind up by 12:30. But the things are that there are a lot of questions. So many questions. So if we could have just maybe for 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes.
I mean, you could ask some of the important questions. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, exactly. We will just select a few, and that's it. Huh?
I just asked this as a question of method for some of us slightly selfish who keep working on caste for the moment. Of late, there's been a very distinct change in questions and approaches to caste in Bengal. While earlier there was an emphasis on questions of material entitlement, the focus has increasingly shifted to question of who talks about it or who gets to voice the concerns really. And that leads to a clear new dilemma as to how to pose questions of caste. And to put it very, very bluntly, can a Bandyopadhyay like me, for instance, talk about questions of caste or Dalit discrimination? What are your thoughts on questions of method? Because to me, it seemed that this question irrevocably moves towards a kind of what used to be called gentrification, where the question of voice becomes, or representation, becomes more important or as important as that of material entitlement of resources leading to power. power seems to now come from the ability to get to speak or to represent. Earlier, if it was coming presumably from material resources such as land, employment, and security in terms of material resources, it now is increasingly coming from a second generation concerns, which roughly gives you articulation. Who gets to speak for the Indian past? Dipesh Chakraborty once spoke metaphorically. Now, who gets to speak on questions of caste really these days in view of these changes? It's a methodological query, really, not so much a question to a senior from a junior. That's it. And that's how I'd like to sign off. Yeah.
It's a very, very important questions about scholarly representation. I mean, this was, an issue, a point which was, I believe, first raised by Gopal Guru in an article in Economic and Political Weekly, that non-Dalit writing on the Dalit cannot write from the lived experience, and they theorize only from outside. And I completely in agreement with that. And a non-Dalit writing on Dalit has to acknowledge that, has to consciously acknowledge that they cannot claim any inside knowledge, any lived experience about the subject they're writing on. So, having said that, should we say that a non-Dalit cannot write on Dalit? I would argue that yes, they can, because there is also a kind of need for other scholars to write about this, because I believe this is an area more research has to be done. And scholars who have their professional training, they can go into the archives, they can rummage through these statistics and come up with the facts and figures and so on. Because with the subject of Dalit history, there is also a question of social justice. And in order to make your claim for social justice, it is not enough to say that to talk about your day-to-day life experience. You also have to come with broader macro data, statistical analysis, archival data, and so on. So in other words, which a professional historian who may not be a Dalit, who has that empathy to write about the groups who have been in a disadvantageous position within the power structure, willing to write, can write. Now the issue is, you can either dismiss the non-Dalit historians and just don't read about them, or there is other way around. I mean, professional historians can wish away the Dalits writing about themselves because they do not follow the professional norms and professional things. I mean, I still remember a discussion I had with some of the editors of the Subaltern Studies when they first received the article by Kancha Ilaya, which had no footnotes. So they were in a dilemma what to do with that article. It's a historical article entirely written from lived experience without any footnotes. Now, no professional journal would possibly, at that period of time, would accept an article without footnotes or the historian's protocol. But I think that is a very important part of the Dalit history writing, whereas the professional historians using the professional protocol, exploring archives, exploring statistics, writing about the social justice situation, that is also important. And the two can talk to each other. And if the two talk to each other, we can perhaps arrive at a more holistic understanding of the situation. But a non-Dalit writing about Dalit history must acknowledge that he or she does not have that lived experience. And I recently wrote a paper on 2 autobiographies, And I think the Dalit autobiographies, this first-person narrative by the Dalit themselves about their life, gives the non-Dalit historians and social scientists a rare entry into the inner life of these people. So, and non-Dalit historians and social scientists can use such sources, but in other words, I mean, what I'm very particular about it, there has to be a conscious acknowledgement that this is writing from outside.
And it's been an education. Thank you. Very, very grateful, and hope to engage later as well. Thank you, Nandita, for the opportunity too.
Thank you, Anirban, for this wonderful questionnaire that you had prepared, and that actually, it gave us a very different meaning to this program, of this engaging interactive program. But unfortunately, actually, we have few more questions. So, sir, shall we continue for?
Yeah, you just tell me the questions and I'll just take them together.
Right. I will. Yes. Okay. Okay, so there is a question from Deboshmita Dev. I don't know whether she's here. In last few years, there has been increased interest on researching caste in Bengal. What do you think triggered this research interest in a state where caste is still believed to be a non-issue in commonsensical understanding? Okay, shall we take all the questions together,
Yes,
sir? Yeah. I think that's better. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so even we have our scholars, Dipanjan. Dipanjan, would you like to question yourself? Because you have not sent me anything till now. We have our own scholars. Can you please?
Ma'am, I have a question.
Yes.
Yes, you can just directly ask him whatever you want to ask.
At one point of the conversation, Professor Bandyopadhyay sir says, assimilation is not integration. So in that context, I want to ask this question. To counter the cultural hegemony, the indigenous people maintain a solidarity and autonomy. They fear to get assimilated with the mainstream upper caste culture. For instance, tribal people are so sensitive about their disciplines and their own community-based judiciary system. My question is, can integration happen without assimilation? Does integration mean retaining individual identity without getting consumed by the Leviathan culture? That's all.
Yep.
Okay. So then there is one more, I think, two questions from our PhD scholar Jagannath Dalal from Department of History. Number one, whether any impartial research work has been done till now on the psychological trauma of displaced families, especially on women and children during partition.
Okay.
Number two, today the integrity of the country is facing threats on the grounds of communalism. Can the solution be found in the practice of toleration, which is the essence of all religion?
Okay.
Okay, sir. বাংলায় কিছু প্রশ্ন আছে স্যার, মানে বাংলাটা পরে আসবো কি? Shall we?
আমি এই তিনজনের প্রশ্নটা রেসপন্ড করি because these are very important questions. Recent increased interest in research on caste. I think recent generations and more public discussion on caste situation in Bengal has revealed that caste still remains in Bengal. Caste question has not been resolved. Caste question is there. I mean, in recent years, some of the leading sociologists and anthropologists have said, like Ashish Nandi or others have said that Bengal is in fact the most casteist society, Partha Chatterjee has said. So a number of very high-profile intellectuals have said that, and that kind of raises interest among the junior scholars as well. So in other words, I mean, at least within the scholarly community, there is now more realization that caste does matter in Bengal, and this is an area which should be researched. So that's my brief response to that question. Assimilation, integration, that's a very, very important question. I mean, I think there are two parts in the process. Integration is followed sometimes by assimilation, but my reading of the history is that integration does not necessarily lead to assimilation. Integration is strategically aligning with certain groups for specific reasons within a particular historical context, within a particular historical conjunction. But that is not to lose your separate identity. Only for the time being, you make a compromise within that situation. Just let me give you some concrete examples from my own work. I mean, the Navashudra movement in the 1946-47 period, when the partition politics had become very powerful, very strong, and the Navashudra community living in the East Bengal countryside were being kind of apprehensive about what would happen to their homeland where they lived. And given the powerful political alignments that were happening around that time, the movement was divided. There was a group which kind of embraced the Ambedkarite politics and this All India Scheduled Caste Federation, and that went into alignment with the Muslim League. So that's one kind of alignment. The other kind of alignment was P.R. Thakur and the Matua Mahasangha. They did not go with that. They remained with the Congress. They wanted Bengal to be divided, but with proper arrangement for the rehabilitation of that. But did this mean that both these two groups either went with the Muslim, completely allied with the Muslim League, or completely aligned with the Congress? Similarly, around the same time, many of the Namashudra peasants participated in the Tebhaga movement, which was being led by the Communist Bengal Provincial Kisan Sabha. Similarly, many of them were, at least some of them were participating in the Hindu Mahasabha instigated communal riots in the East Bengal countryside. So this is what I would say, whatever term you mean, I see integration as a strategic alliance within a particular historical conjuncture. This strategic alliance changed after 1947. The All India Scheduled Caste Federation's alliance with the Muslim League broke down in 1950. Jogen Mandal came back from Pakistan to West Bengal. P.R. Thakur, and the Matua Mahasangha, which had identified with the Congress, and what could argue that they had integrated with the Congress mainstream, but no. In 1964, P.R. Thakur resigned from the Congress, and the entire Matua movement came out of this whole thing. So what really tells me that they had not assimilated into that particular political strains. So the assimilation, which is a cultural, social integration, social and cultural loss of identity, that is a very, very different process, and which does not easily happen. And these people do not so easily lose their identity, lose their traditional culture, even though within the public sphere, in the political circle, in the political sphere, political space, electoral space, they make temporary adjustment or temporary alignments. So that's my kind of response to you, which is a very important question. Impartial research on displaced person, yes, there have been number of studies, maybe not in the form of a book yet, but a number of articles have appeared, particularly dealing with the plight of the Dalit refugees. One or two books also have appeared where this is not the major theme of the book, but these books deal with this theme. But I think a full book needs to be written, but there has been writing on displaced people, particularly Dalit displaced people, but in different forms, in articles and parts of the book chapters and so on. So the writings have started appearing. Communalism, toleration, I mean, this is a question which we cannot end, the discussion we cannot have in 5 minutes.
Very true. So there is a question from Department of English. He is also our faculty, Professor Jyoti Shankar Mondal, who says, sir, you have pointed out that archives should be questioned as well as redefined. Would you please throw some light on the redefinition and the restructuring of archives?
First of all, archives has to be questioned. I mean, in a very traditional sense, by archives, we usually meant the government archives, where all the government reports are retained. And there is, or there can be a tendency that whatever we find in writing in those reports, we take them to be facts. But we need to remember that those are not necessarily facts per se, but those are facts as stated by a particular government official who's writing it. So every document has its own autobiography. Every document has been written by someone. Every document reflects some kind of a bias. Every document represents some kind of a particular point of view of a government or of a government official, and so on. So a historian's responsibility is to question that document incessantly. That's the first thing. That is how we question the archive. The second thing is to redefine the archive. I mean, as I said, in a traditional sense, by archive, we meant only the government archive where we have the government documents to read. But now anything can be archived. I mean, oral history is another kind of area where the historians have to get in. If the historians have to work on contemporary history, they cannot rely on the archives, because particularly in India, archives is very, very difficult to, but I mean, it's not just available if you're working on contemporary history. So in those cases, you have to look at alternative archives, like you have to have oral history interviews, you have to use literature, you have to use other pamphlets and various kinds of other materials, different layers of literature, the high literature, the lower literature of the grassroots, at the grassroots level. Newspapers, the top newspapers of the metropolitan level, as well as the local newspapers and things like that. So the whole definition, and you could, I mean, some historians are also using material objects, the visual representations, photographs, films. Film has become a major source of historical writing. And once again, you have to remember, as you question the government documents, you also have to question your other sources, other archives as well. You have to question oral history, the transcripts of oral history interviews, because that is also someone talking to you from memory. And with memory comes forgetfulness, and people remember selectively. So what this person is remembering, what this person is forgetting. So memory and oblivion come together. I mean, so those who work on with oral history methods need to remember all these things. When you use literature as a source, you have to remember literature does not give you fact per se. literature is also representation by a particular author. That author has her or his own biases. So one has to question all those sources as we question our official government archive. So that's what I wanted to mean. That's how we have to question the archives and reconfigure our archive. Okay, anything else?
Yes, sir. Sir, there are few more questions. Shall we take one last question in English and then 2-3 questions in Bangla? That's it. Okay, so there is a question from Rajiv Roshan Ghoshal, who says, thanks for the outstanding conversation. Though my query is different line of this conversation, but also in modern perspective to Sekhar Bandyopadhyay sir, that how important and also significance of mesmering medicine through hypnotism for painless surgery in colonial Bengal in contemporary historical research perspective.
This is very
to
my interest. I can't understand.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. Absolutely, and I don't know how it's just ignorance part of medicine kind of question.
Yeah.
So then I think, right. I have our PhD scholar Kalipada Mura. So he wrote 1920 দশকে যে মুসলিম ভাবাবেগ ভারতীয়ত্ব ও মুসলিম সত্তার মধ্যে কোনো পার্থক্য খুঁজে পায়নি, পরবর্তীকালে সেই মুসলমানদের মধ্যেই পৃথক জাতিসত্তার জন্ম লাভে, আমি আরেকবার পড়ে দেব, I will repeat, sir, I will repeat. সমকালীন মুসলিম জনসমাজ এবং কংগ্রেস অভ্যন্তরীণ রাজনীতির ভূমিকা কতটা ছিল সংক্ষিপ্তভাবে আলোচিত হলে বিষয়টি স্পষ্ট হতো। আই এম রিপিটিং। 1920 দশকে যে মুসলিম ভাবাবেগ ভারতীয়ত্ব ও মুসলিম সত্তার মধ্যে কোনো পার্থক্য খুঁজে পায়নি, পরবর্তীকালে সেই মুসলমানদের মধ্যে পৃথক জাতিসত্তার জন্ম লাভে সমকালীন মুসলমান অভ্যন্তরীণ রাজনীতির ভূমিকা কতটা ছিল। 1 নম্বর কালীপদ, is it আরেকটা আছে, there is another one, তো I think হ্যাঁ স্যার বলুন।
একসঙ্গেই করবো।
হ্যাঁ একসাথে, ব্যাস এইগুলো আর মানে করে আমরা প্রাক স্বাধীনোত্তরকালীন ভারতবর্ষে যেভাবে দলিত রাজনীতির সাংগঠনিক জন্ম এবং সম্প্রসারণ এক্সপ্যানশন মুসলমানদের মধ্যে পৃথক রাজনৈতিক সত্তার আত্মপ্রকাশে দলিতরা কেন ব্যর্থ হয়েছিল। So he has these 2 questions, right?
মুসলিম পলিটিক্স 1920 দশকের পর থেকে শুধু কংগ্রেসকে দোষ দিয়ে লাভ নেই, এটার পেছনে একটা অনেক রকমের কমপ্লেক্স হিস্টোরিক্যাল ফ্যাক্টরস কাজ করছিল। একদিকে অবশ্যই কংগ্রেসের রাজনীতি রয়েছে, কারণ কংগ্রেসের রাজনীতির মধ্যে কংগ্রেস তো সেই অর্থে কোনো ডিসিপ্লিন পলিটিক্যাল পার্টি কোনোদিন ছিল না। কংগ্রেসের মধ্যে নানান ধরনের মতবাদ ছিল এবং তার মধ্যে প্রচন্ড হিন্দু সংরক্ষণপন্থী মতাবলম্বী লোক প্রচুর ছিলেন। তাদের বিষয়টা, তাদের ব্যাপারগুলো রয়েছে, কিন্তু যেটা হচ্ছে 1930-এর পর থেকে বাংলার রাজনীতি কিন্তু, বা বাংলার মুসলমান রাজনীতি অথবা বাংলার কংগ্রেস রাজনীতি শুধু বাংলার চত্বরেই আবদ্ধ নয়, এই রাজনীতি বৃহৎ ভারতীয় রাজনীতির সঙ্গে একটা ইন্টিগ্রেটেড হয়ে গেছে, এবং ভারতীয় রাজনীতির মধ্যে যেভাবে রিলিজিয়াস পোলারাইজেশনটা হচ্ছে, সেই রিলিজিয়াস পোলারাইজেশনের ইম্প্যাক্ট কিন্তু বাংলাদেশের মুসলমান সমাজের মধ্যেও পড়ছে। অর্থাৎ এই 1920-30-এর দশক এবং 40-এর দশকে বাংলার মুসলমানের ইতিহাসকে আলাদা করে দেখা যাবে না, আর এই ইতিহাসকে বৃহত্তর ভারতীয় ইতিহাসের অংশ হিসেবে দেখতে হবে। এবং এই বৃহত্তর ভারতীয় ইতিহাসে যে সমস্ত নানা রকমের ঐতিহাসিক প্রক্রিয়া চলছিল, তার সবকিছুর প্রভাবই এখানকার রাজনীতির মধ্যেও পড়েছে, এবং সেভাবেই এখানেও বিভাগ বা পোলারাইজেশন হয়ে গেছে, এইটুকুই আমি বলবো। আর প্রাক স্বাধীনতা ভারতবর্ষে দলিত আন্দোলন যেভাবে নিজেদের স্বকীয়তা রাখতে পেরেছে, সেভাবে ঠিক মুসলিম লীগ বা মুসলমানরা যেভাবে তাদের নিজস্ব আত্মপরিচয়কে প্রতিষ্ঠা করতে পেরেছে রাজনৈতিকভাবে, সেটা পারেনি। এবং কিন্তু প্রশ্ন আছে যে এটাতে কিন্তু একটা পসিবিলিটি ছিল that Dalit politics could be a third alternative in national politics in India. একদিকে কংগ্রেস, আরেকদিকে মুসলিম লীগ, এবং মাঝখান তার মধ্যে তৃতীয় শক্তি হিসেবে দলিত গোষ্ঠীর উত্থান সম্ভব হতো। কিন্তু সমস্যা হচ্ছে যে এই দলিত আন্দোলনের ইতিহাসটা কিন্তু মুসলমান আন্দোলনের ইতিহাসের মতো অতটা পুরনো নয়। মুসলমানদের মধ্যে পলিটিক্যাল মোবিলাইজেশন we can witness right from the late 19th early 20th centuries. Late 19th early 20th centuries থেকেই কিন্তু এই মুসলমান রাজনীতিটা ক্রমশ অর্গানাইজড হচ্ছে। 1905-এ গিয়ে মুসলিম লীগ, 1906-এ গিয়ে মুসলিম লীগ প্রতিষ্ঠিত হয়ে যাচ্ছে, এবং সেখানে একটা সারা ভারতীয় অর্গানাইজেশন আছে। আলিগড়, বম্বে, বাংলা, এই তিনটে মিলিয়ে মুসলিম লীগের অর্গানাইজেশন একটা সর্বভারতীয় রূপ পাচ্ছে। কিন্তু সেটা কিন্তু দলিত আন্দোলনের ক্ষেত্রে হচ্ছে না। দলিত আন্দোলনের ক্ষেত্রে অল ইন্ডিয়া অর্গানাইজেশন হচ্ছে যখন 1940-এ গিয়ে 1942-তে গিয়ে আম্বেদকর অল ইন্ডিয়া শিডিউল কাস্ট ফেডারেশন স্থাপন করলেন। তার আগে 1935-এ যে মুভমেন্ট হচ্ছে অল ইন্ডিয়া ডিপ্রেসড ক্লাসেস অ্যাসোসিয়েশন, সেই ডিপ্রেসড ক্লাসেস অ্যাসোসিয়েশন কিন্তু মোটামুটি ভাবে ওয়েস্টার্ন ইন্ডিয়ার এবং নর্থ ইন্ডিয়ার মধ্যে সীমাবদ্ধ, বাংলায় বা অন্য জায়গায় ততটা হয়নি। ওয়েস্টার্ন ইন্ডিয়া বা সাউথ ইন্ডিয়া বা নর্থ ইন্ডিয়ার কিছু অংশে এই আন্দোলনটা শুরু হচ্ছে, কিন্তু তার যে একটা অল ইন্ডিয়া কোঅর্ডিনেশন, সেটা কিন্তু 1940-এর দশকের আগে, 42-43-এর আগে হচ্ছে না। আর তারপরেই 46-এ গিয়ে আমরা পার্টিশনের রাজনীতি দেখতে পাচ্ছি, যে পার্টিশনের রাজনীতিতে একটা রিলিজিয়াস পোলারাইজেশন হচ্ছে, হিন্দু মুসলমানের ভাগ হয়ে যাচ্ছে। তার মধ্যে দলিতদের অবস্থান, আম্বেদকর যদিও তৃতীয় অবস্থান তৈরি করার চেষ্টা করছেন, কিন্তু আম্বেদকর সেই অর্গানাইজেশনটা তৈরি করার সময় পাননি। তার আগেই পার্টিশনের রাজনীতি এসে গেছে, পুরো রাজনীতির চেহারাটা পাল্টে গেছে, যার ফলে দলিতরা মুসলমানদের মতন, মুসলমান রাজনীতির মতন একটা সর্বভারতীয় অর্গানাইজেশনে আসতে পারেনি। এবং এই দলিত আন্দোলনের সংগঠনগুলো খুব লোকালাইজ ছিল, বিভিন্ন লোকালিটি, বিভিন্ন রিজিয়নে এই মুভমেন্ট গুলো অর্গানাইজড হচ্ছিল, এবং কতগুলো রিজিয়নে এটা খুব পাওয়ারফুল ছিল, কতগুলো রিজিয়নে একদম ছিলই না। তো যার ফলে একটা অল ইন্ডিয়া অর্গানাইজেশন, অল ইন্ডিয়া ফোকাস এই মুভমেন্টে আসে অনেক দেরিতে, compared to the Muslim League politics which started in the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century. সুতরাং আমার মনে হয় that was a major organizational problem which the Dalit had vis-a-vis the Muslim organizations.
থ্যাংক ইউ
অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ স্যার।
অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ। হ্যাঁ কালী, আচ্ছা আমার this is 12:50, so sure still the questions কিন্তু আমার মনে হয় যে অনেক
এবার হাঁপিয়ে গেছি।
So do we have any other observations, anyone who wants to comment on today's presentation of such a brilliant brainstorming session we have from the morning? So, if there anyone else, Ushoshi, anyone? Anyone from the faculties? Anyone from the department? Okay, then I would also like to extend my vote of thanks to whoever made this event successful. First of all, I would thank Registrar Sir to kindly do who had delivered this welcome address, and then our assistant registrar sir, and who had been the throughout with us. He was always with us as a technical assistant, and without his assistance I would not be able to do any kind of webinar or work and kind of a session with involving so many people. So thank you, thanks a lot, Ravi Shankar sir, kindly be with us. Then I would also thank Anirban for posing such brilliant, thought-provoking questions, insightful questions and observations that gave a completely different impetus, different meaning to the program. And last but not the least, my sincere most thanks to Professor Bandyopadhyay sir. Sir, you really made this event look so special to us. And there will be recording. We are also doing it in YouTube live. So I think, and then this feedback session, people are asking me whether they will get the feedback session. Of course, we will send them the feedback link also. So a big thank you, sir, for taking time out from your busy schedule. And I really wish that we could even have you again with us for some future program, some future maybe program, collaborative program. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. I enjoyed talking. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Okay. Okay, with this, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you, everyone. Everybody who have made this event successful. Wish you all a happy puja, happy Sharadiya. Thank you. Thank you.
হ্যালো, বলুন বলুন বলুন, কি বলুন? 80 800 111। ঠিক আছে, ঠিক আছে। প্রোগ্রাম শেষ হয়ে গেছে?